The new Plymouth Neon also has dual airbags, available anti-lock brakes, and a sophisticated impact management system. The rich, it would appear, do not have it all.
Plymouth tends to elicit yawns from most people, at least those who remember it. For most of my lifetime, while they had a few interesting vehicles like the Prowler, most were just cheap and decontented Dodges. But for a brand created to compete against the low prices of Chevy and Ford, Plymouth has an interesting story. And this is a far too brief history of Plymouth. So welcome back to All Cars, y'all. I am John, and I want to say thank you to my Patreon supporters for reaching out and help supporting this. I'll admit I don't love Plymouth. For most of my life, they were just the cheap Chrysler product, always slightly less attractive and less as equipped as their Dodge counterparts. But unlike other brands such as Pontiac and Mercury that were canceled, I find that I miss Plymouth. I find myself thinking that Chrysler as a whole missed an opportunity with the brand. Now, as with my other histories, the story doesn't start with Chrysler. In about 1904, Jonathan Dixon Maxwell, who had worked for Oldsmobile, and Benjamin Briscoe founded Maxwell Briscoe Company in North Tarrytown, New York to produce a car. A fire destroyed the factory, and in 1907 they opened a huge factory in Newcastle, Indiana, intended for raw materials to go in one end and a finished car to come out of the other. This factory actually ended up continuing as a Chrysler plant until 2004. While they were successful, briefly being one of the top 3 firms next to GM and Ford, they eventually became part of what was known as the United States Motor Company. That gets its own video at some point, but that's a story for another day. In 1913, Maxwell was reorganized as Maxwell Motor Company and moved to Highland Park, Michigan. By 1916, they'd sold about 60,000 cars, but after World War I, they were deeply in debt, and Walter P. Chrysler took them over in the early 1920s. In 1925, Chrysler formed Chrysler Corporation, and Maxwell was phased out, although their new 4-cylinder Chrysler 52 of 1926 was largely a Maxwell design, and this was later reworked into what would be the first Plymouth Model Q. Plymouth was introduced as a brand name in 1928 as the low-priced entry to compete with Chevy and Ford. While priced slightly higher initially, they offered more equipment and didn't even get their own dealer network, being sold largely through Chrysler dealers. The logo was of a ship, specifically the Mayflower, that landed at Plymouth, Massachusetts. However, the inspiration for the name came from Plymouth binder twine because of the popularity of the twine with farmers. With the Great Depression hitting and other manufacturers closing down, Plymouth models helped keep Chrysler afloat. Models were sold through all 3 Chrysler divisions of Chrysler DeSoto and Dodge. By 1931, Plymouth rose to number 3 in the sales charts among all cars. Their 1931 model PA had a 196 cubic inch 4-cylinder making 56 rampaging horsepowers and boasted, quote, the smoothness of an 8, the economy of a 4, with its floating power. Essentially, the engine was attached to the frame with rubber mounts to dampen vibrations. This also had an unusual, for its time, features such as a fuel pump, hydraulic shock absorbers, and an electric gas gauge. In 1933, Plymouth added a 3.1-liter flathead 6 from Chrysler to match engine offerings from Ford, Chevy, and Pontiac in their brand new Plymouth PC. With a short wheelbase, it sold poorly, so they quickly took a Dodge chassis with a 112-inch wheelbase, put the PC body on it with a different hood and fenders, and christened it the PD. The PC was then redesigned to resemble it and named the Standard 6. By 1939, Plymouth produced 417,000 cars, and their 1939 convertible coupe with a 3.3-liter flathead 6 producing 82 horsepower was featured at the New York World's Fair as the first mass-produced production convertible with a power folding top. By 1940 and 41, Plymouth was challenging Ford for second place in sales. In the 50s and early 60s, Chrysler experimented with a turbine-powered car. While we won't go into that here, they used a version of the Plymouth Belvedere, a two-door hardtop introduced in response to the 1950 Chevy Bel Air. Standard power was a 4.6-liter straight six with 97 horsepower. In 1956, Plymouth introduced the Fury, a special high-end car based on the Belvedere and originally with a 303 cubic inch V8 making 240 horsepower. Optional equipment included an air conditioner, automatic power steering, and power brakes. In 1957, the new forward-look design led to cars that made Chevys and Fords immediately look dated, and Plymouth advertised them as, quote, "Suddenly it's 1960. In 1957, production soared to 726,000 units, jumping about 200,000 over 1956 sales. However, these cars had poor quality and corrosion protection. They were very rust-prone and greatly damaged Chrysler's reputation. In the 1960s, these quality issues hurt sales, but Plymouth remained profitable, and in 1961, the Valiant Compact became a Plymouth, and with rumors that the 62 Chevys were going to be downsized, Chrysler introduced a smaller, standard Plymouth. Unfortunately, they were caught wrong-footed as Chevy didn't shrink their cars, and this time, when bigger was better, Plymouth hit a sales slump. In 1963, the Fury, Belvedere, and Savoy were all slightly larger with new body styles and restyled again in 64, and in 65, the Fury was built on the new C-body platform. It was offered a Fury 1, Fury 2, and Fury 3, as well as a Sport Fury intending to combine luxury and sport. The Savoy was discontinued, and the Belvedere classified as an intermediate and keeping the B-body platform. As performance increasingly took center stage in the late 60s, Plymouth responded. The Barracuda was introduced in 1964 based on the Valiant and with a slant 6 or a 4.5-liter V8. In 67, they introduced the Belvedere GTX with either a 7.2-liter Super Commando or the 7-liter Hemi V8s. In 1968, they stripped down a Belvedere coupe and called it the Roadrunner. The 1970s, as with other car manufacturers, it was a rough time for Plymouth. New emissions and safety regulations, along with high gas prices and an economic downturn, meant demand dropped for all muscle cars. Performance deteriorated as engines were strangled and the big block options were discontinued. In 1970, the Barracuda was separated from the Valiant and no longer a fastback, being only a coupe and a convertible. Built on a shorter, wider version of the Chrysler B-body platform, it was now called the E-body and shared with the Dodge Challenger, but not sharing any sheet metal. The Barracuda ended in 1974, 10 years to the day after it began. The compact Valiant, introduced in 1967, continued to sell well, in fact, setting a sales record in 1971 of nearly 250,000 units. It was considered attractive, economical, a good value, and durable. They badge-engineered a Dodge Dart Swinger as the Valiant Scamp, and in 1972 combined had the best sales of the Valiant model with over 330,000 sold. Through the early 1970s, the Valiant composed more than 40% of Plymouth's sales volume. In 1974, the next generation Valiant was introduced and was rebadged Dodge Dart, and in 1975, the Plymouth Volare was famously introduced and was its official replacement. Now, the Volare was intended to be a more luxurious and desirable car than the dated Valiant, and the Volare and its Aspen twin were Motor Trend's Car of the Year for 1976, as well as being very well regarded by Consumer Reports. It was downsized, extensively wind tunnel tested, and had many improvements made during development to reduce weight and improve fuel economy. The standard engine was Chrysler's 3.7-liter slant 6 with two different V8 options. They sold well with 255,000 its first year, 327,000 in 77, and 217 in 1978. However, they developed a horrible reputation such as prematurely rusting, stalling, catching on fire, hoods becoming unlatched, or failure of the front suspension. In just its first year, it had at least 8 serious recalls. Chrysler had rushed the product to market in need of cash, but sales tanked, and their poor reputation and huge recall bills helped push Chrysler close to bankruptcy. Realizing the front-wheel drive 4-cylinder cars of the imports could meet new requirements that had come out, Chrysler introduced the Plymouth Horizon and Dodge Omni twins based on one of their European platforms. They sold well and stayed on sale until 1987, but it was not enough to save the company by itself. For the 1980s, the story of Chrysler's troubles at the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s are well known and well covered. They were running out of cash, they were near bankruptcy, they hired Lee Iacocca and had to go to the government hat in hand to get loan guarantees. Chrysler had seen the coming downsizing and 4-cylinder move and was preparing for it, but they were running out of time. The government guarantees came through, the loans came in, and the result was the K-car platform. And Plymouth got the Reliant. It's offered as a 2-door coupe, a 4-door sedan, and a 4-door station wagon. These cars catered to American tastes at the time when 6-passenger 2-bench seats and a column shifter were still desirable. They had a new 2.2-liter 4-cylinder and a Mitsubishi 2.6 6-cylinder as an option. Interestingly, the Mitsubishi engine had a hemispherical combustion chamber, so the 1981 model actually got a Hemi badge on the front fenders. Heresy. They sold well their first year with about 150,000 units moving, and they were Motor Trend's Car of the Year for 1981. In the next 9 years, they sold almost 1.1 million Reliants. In 1982, they downsized the Grand Fury again, now sharing the M platform with the Chrysler Fifth Avenue and the Dodge Diplomat. This platform dated back to the 76 Volare, so while it lasted until 1989, the Grand Fury was never a huge sales success and was technologically obsolete. In 1984, Plymouth got a version of the new and the groundbreaking MiniVans called the Voyager. Derived from the K-car, it shared many components with the K-cars, including the instrument cluster and dashboard controls, and of course its front-wheel drive layout. And as you know, the minivan was a huge hit for Chrysler, and in 1987 they made cosmetic updates and introduced the lengthened Grand Voyager. Of historic note, the Voyager and its sibling, the Caravan, are considered the first mass-produced vehicles to have dedicated built-in cup holders. Also in 1987, the Sundance was introduced, another variant of the K-car platform, but now called the P-body. It was originally intended to be a Plymouth Horizon replacement, but with Hyundai and Yugo coming into the market, they decided to make the car more substantial. Engines were 4-cylinders, 4-cylinder turbos, and later a Mitsubishi 3.0-liter V6, and that was called the Duster, which really rubbed some people wrong. Sales were solid in the 75,000 per year range, and it ran all the way up to 93. In 1989, Plymouth got the Acclaim. While widely considered the replacement for the K-cars, the Sundance was actually dimensionally closer. This was based on an AA platform, another stretched and heavily revised version of the K platform. Engines were the 2.5-liter 4-cylinder, making about 100 horsepower, and an optional Mitsubishi 3-liter with about 141 horsepower. Sales were okay, with nearly 78,000 its first year and 110,000 its second, but it quickly dropped off until it ended in 1995. It's important to note here that Plymouths of the 80s were merely badge-engineered versions of Dodge and Chrysler models. Different wheel choices, perhaps unique taillights, the Plymouth grille, but Chrysler was increasingly doing what GM did, of badge engineering their products. It would just hurt Chrysler far more. Those days of sharing a platform but having some unique body on it and some unique content really had faded away. And by the 1990s, Plymouth had lost much of its identity and was just the cheaper, less contented, more boring version of Dodge models. Plymouths overlapped with and competed on features and price against both Dodge and the Eagle brand, and had no unique models for themselves. Chrysler tried to remedy this by focusing Plymouth as the entry-level brand with a new logo, but advertisements that focused solely on value meant this actually narrowed down their buyer appeal even more, and sales continued to fall. In 1993, Chrysler introduced the LH car, and while I've spoken glowingly before of how fabulous these cars were, Plymouth was considered to get one to be called the Accolade, but it never did. As mentioned above, the Sundance was canceled in 93 and the Acclaim in 95. In 1991, the second generation minivan was introduced on a largely carried over platform, but in 96 the minivans were redesigned from the ground up, abandoning its K-car roots and using the new NS platform, and also introduced the driver's side sliding door. Marketing changed slightly, moving the Voyager to the entry-level Chrysler minivan instead of being a direct counterpart opposite of the Dodge Caravan.
But with a 3-liter, 150 horsepower V6 engine, it has 36 times the cargo space of a Porsche 911.
In 1994, the Breeze was introduced and built on the JA platform, specifically to replace the Acclaim. Now, I've also spoken very highly of this platform, and I think it's largely unappreciated, but while it still sold over 230,000 units, it never sold as well as the Acclaim. As the value line, the Breeze didn't offer a V6, didn't have alloy wheels, didn't have leather interior, body-colored door handles, fog lights, or auto-stick transmission. It ultimately ended in 2000. The Neon was introduced in 94 as a 95 model year vehicle. It was offered as a 4-door and a 2-door, and with single and dual overhead cam versions of Chrysler's 2.0-liter 4-cylinder, making respectively 132 horsepower or 150, and were offered with a 5-speed manual or a newly designed 3-speed. It was a new car designed to directly compete against the Japanese models, beating them handily both in base horsepower and optional engines and handling. Sprightly, they were very popular for racing, but also had some odd option availability, such as no power window option for the rear doors. It sold well, but was never quite the import-killing home run it was expected to be. The second generation Neon was introduced in 2000. Now, the Prowler was based on a 1993 concept car of the same name, and was introduced in 97 as a front-engine, rear-drive, rear transmission throwback to the 1930s hot rods. It had a 3.5-liter V6 from the LH sedans, making 214 horsepower, and in 99 got a more powerful version with 253 horsepower, dramatically helping its performance. While it had many features and options that made it a modern, comfortable, everyday use kind of car, it ultimately was just a 2-seater with limited luggage space, to the point they even sold a trailer for it, and expensive without being able to back up its looks with sheer performance. The last Prowler was built in 2002, having only sold 11,702 versions. The PT Chrysler was conceived as a unique concept for Plymouth to pair with the Prowler, but ultimately it became a Chrysler. It's important to note that Chrysler merged with Daimler in 1998 in the so-called merger of equals, and with some hindsight we can see that a company dead set on maximizing the Chrysler, Dodge, and Plymouth brands' profitability, partially through decontenting the quality of the interior, stifling design. While we can't know exactly, a value marque that has nothing more than badge-engineered versions of other cars, but with some low volume and individual products like the Prowler, must have been very unappealing to their new German masters. By the late 1990s, Plymouth had only 4 vehicles: the Voyager, the Breeze, the Neon, and the Prowler. Peak production in 1973 of 973,000 units dropped such that the brand sold less than 200,000, with only a few exceptions, after 1990. In 2001, Daimler-Chrysler decided to drop the brand entirely after announcing it on November 3, 1999. The last new model sold as a Plymouth was a second generation Dodge Neon. The PT Chrysler, as I mentioned before, ended up becoming a Chrysler, as did the Prowler and the Voyager. In conclusion, this obviously is not a complete and in-depth history of Plymouth and all of its individual models, and some of those models that really gave Plymouth some pop. I've not mentioned any of the trucks, the Trail Duster, the Laser, so many others. The fact is that my memories of Plymouth are the truly poor quality 70s products, the near bankruptcy, the legend that is Lee Iacocca, and then after that a string of boring vehicles that were seldom more than just cheaper Dodge. As with other brands such as Pontiac that may have had a resurgence, Plymouth was not killed off by a recession. It was killed off by a corporation that didn't know what to do with a slow-selling brand. If you look at the front ends of the PT Chrysler and the Prowler, Chrysler appears to have been taking a retro approach to Plymouth styling, and one must wonder what would have happened if that had continued into the more bread and butter cars. If they finally invested in making Plymouth stand out for more than just having a low price. Unfortunately, we will be left wondering. Still, I ultimately think that killing Plymouth off was the right move. A company the size of Chrysler should not have 3 or 4 brands trying to compete in the marketplace, if you consider Eagle in there as well. Consider that Toyota is huge and they have 2 brands with Toyota and Lexus. While they experimented with Scion for a while, they ultimately canceled it because they couldn't keep it fresh and keep the sales up. Even Ford had to right size and eliminate the Mercury division, and it's taken about 20 years since then for their future and current and continued investment in Lincoln to start to pay off in really excellent products. I believe that Plymouth and Dodge would have forever fought for the value-minded buyer, and each would end up cannibalizing each other. Plymouth had a long and storied brand, but who really looks at a 98 Breeze and thinks, man, I'm sorry they're gone. Unfortunately, those days of Plymouth having unique metal and being special were far in the rearview mirror by about 20 to 30 years at that point. And ultimately, I do think it was the right answer for Chrysler, Daimler-Chrysler, to cut them and refocus on their other brands. It's a story for another day, whether that worked out. Thanks for watching, y'all. All right, thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. If you like this video and you want to see more just like it, please support the channel. Please subscribe. Please thumbs up this video. And please leave me a comment below what you think, if you've got some memories of Plymouth, and if you've got some ideas for future histories you'd like to see. And finally, I need to give a big thank you to my Patreon supporters who help make this possible and show their support for independent news, opinions, and histories. Thanks, guys.